The city of Cincinnati, Ohio, had always known its share of pain, like any American city with neighborhoods stretched thin between poverty, promise, and everything in between. But few stories would stain its streets with the kind of deep, soul-piercing horror that unfolded quietly between 2005 and 2009. It wasn't just a case of murder. It wasn't just the chilling story of a man who hunted young girls. It was the brutal unraveling of innocence, time and time again, under the eyes of a justice system that had already failed once. And this time, it would cost far more lives. Anthony Kirkland wasn't an enigma. He was never a mystery. His darkness had been documented, his crimes recorded, his capacity for evil known. In fact, the world had already seen what he was capable of. He had already killed once. He had already gone to prison. And then, despite every sign that he was a predator cloaked in remorse, he was released. And when he was, he picked up exactly where he left off, only worse. With every new life he took, the terror grew more intimate. His victims weren't strangers to the world. They were daughters, sisters, teenage girls with bright futures and easy laughter, and one by one he extinguished them. But this story doesn't start in 2005. It starts much earlier, in the fractured corridors of a childhood full of neglect, abandonment, and festering rage. Anthony Kirkland was born in 1968, and from an early age, something seemed off. Teachers described him as distant, withdrawn, prone to explosive outbursts. There was violence simmering just beneath his surface. But back then, in the late 70s and early 80s, emotional disturbances in Black children were often ignored, misdiagnosed, or criminalized outright. Instead of help, he was offered silence. And that silence, fertile soil for resentment, grew darker every year. By the time he reached adulthood, Anthony had built an emotional world rooted in entitlement and dominance. Women in particular became targets of his rage. Not strangers, but women he believed owed him something. When he was 24 years old, that rage exploded into irreversible violence. In 1987, he murdered Leola Douglas, a young woman he had been dating. After a heated argument, he strangled her, set her body on fire, and left her for dead. It was a vicious, hateful crime, and yet, when he was convicted, he wasn't found guilty of murder. He was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. The system called it a crime of passion, and he was sentenced to just 10 to 25 years. It would become one of the most damning judicial oversights in the city's history. Because after serving 16 years, Anthony Kirkland was released. And when he got out in 2004, he was not rehabilitated. He was not remorseful. He was patient, calculated, and waiting. In the early months of 2006, the city was blissfully unaware that it had a predator walking among it. Kirkland had blended back into society with disturbing ease. He took odd jobs, lived in transitional housing, kept to himself, smiled when necessary. And beneath that surface, the old rage was bubbling, hotter than ever. His first known victim after release was Casonya Crawford, just 14 years old. She was a bright girl, full of energy and curiosity. She had dreams of being a nurse. Her life was ahead of her in every way. But on a late summer evening in 2006, she never came home. Her body was later found burned in a wooded area, almost unrecognizable. The signs of strangulation, sexual assault, and fire, Kirkland's signature, were clear. But at that time, police had no idea they were looking for a man who had done this before. The case rattled the community. Parents clutched their children closer. Teenagers walked home in groups. But as the months passed and no arrests were made, the urgency slowly drained from the headlines. What remained was fear, and what followed next was more death. Just a year later, in 2007, another young girl vanished. Her name was Esme Kenney. She was just 13, a talented student, a quiet soul who loved reading, singing, and spending time with her mom. She left for a jog one evening and never returned. Her mother knew instantly that something was wrong. Esme wasn't the type of girl to disappear. She was thoughtful, predictable, kind. Her body was found near Winton Hills Reservoir, burned, mutilated, strangled, and again, no immediate answers. The community began to panic. Now there was a pattern. Now there was a shadow stretching over the neighborhoods where children once played without fear. By the time investigators finally linked the murders together and focused in on Anthony Kirkland, the horror was too heavy to bear. They discovered that he had not only killed these two young girls, but had also been tied to the murders of two more women, Mary Jo Newton and Kimya Rolison. Both were adults, both victims of his manipulation, both killed with the same cruel pattern: strangulation, followed by fire. Fire, he later told detectives, was his way of purifying what he had done. As if the blaze could erase the brutality, the details of his crimes were sickening. He stalked his victims, charmed them sometimes. Sometimes he simply overpowered them, but always he ended them in the same gruesome way: hands around the throat, followed by the sickening hiss of flame. Investigators, hardened from years of fieldwork, said his confessions were some of the most chilling they'd ever heard. There was no remorse, no regret, just a cold recitation of facts, like a man listing items at a store. What made the pain worse was the timeline. If he had been sentenced appropriately for the first murder, if the system had acknowledged his danger back in 1987, 4 innocent lives could have been saved. Esme, Casonya, Mary Jo, Kimya. Their deaths were preventable, and that realization, more than anything, sent the city into a collective grief that bordered on rage. At the trial, Anthony Kirkland sat stone-faced, occasionally nodding, occasionally smirking. The courtroom held the mothers of the girls he had destroyed, and their faces, broken but defiant, became symbols of a community that had been betrayed not just by a killer, but by a justice system that let him go. When the jury returned with a verdict of guilty on multiple counts of aggravated murder, rape, and abuse of a corpse, there was no celebration, just silence, and then tears, the kind of tears that don't cleanse, but scar. Anthony Kirkland was sentenced to death. The judge, her voice trembling with controlled fury, said, "You have forfeited your place among us, and you did so with your own hands." But for the families, the sentence meant little, because their daughters would never walk through the door again, would never laugh at the dinner table, would never grow up. The only thing left was memory and the lifelong ache of what should have been. After the conviction, when Anthony Kirkland was officially sent to death row, there was a strange quiet that fell over Cincinnati. Not peace, not justice, just quiet. A quiet born from exhaustion, the kind of silence that follows a storm so violent it leaves no one untouched. Reporters packed up their gear. The police went back to their unsolved cases. The courtroom was empty again. But for the families of the victims, the silence was only the beginning of the next nightmare. Grief that stretches on without time, without a finish line, and without mercy. For Esme Kenney's mother, that grief became her companion. Rebecca Kenney, once a joyful, smiling woman who shared everything with her daughter, from bedtime stories to Sunday walks, was now hollowed out. The image of Esme's small, bruised, and burned body haunted her sleep. The words of the autopsy report rang louder than any lullaby she used to sing. No mother should ever have to identify her child that way. No mother should be asked, in that kind of sterile room, "Are you sure it's her?" When the body has been so disfigured, so burned, that identity comes down to dental records and fragments of clothing. She began to withdraw from the world. The house where Esme once laughed and read books in the living room became a graveyard of memories. The bedroom, untouched, remained frozen in time. Her friends offered support, kind words, casseroles, but none of it reached the part of her that had died along with her daughter. She didn't want kindness. She wanted her child, and the world had no way to give her that. At vigils, she tried to speak. Once, on a cold March evening, candles flickered in front of a school Esme once attended. Mothers held their daughters tighter. Teenagers wiped away tears. And Rebecca, standing under the weight of unimaginable loss, whispered into the microphone, "He should have never been free." That phrase echoed. It landed hard, because everyone knew it was true. This wasn't just a story of a serial killer. It was a story of preventable murder, of ignored warnings, of a justice system that believed a man who had burned a woman alive could somehow be rehabilitated. Anthony Kirkland had fooled the system, yes, but only because the system let itself be fooled. His behavior in prison was not reformation. It was camouflage. He read. He avoided fights. He said all the right things. And the parole board, blinded by the paper trail instead of the person behind it, believed him. They didn't ask why he'd set Leola Douglas on fire. They asked whether he'd taken an anger management course, and when he had, they let him out. Years later, when asked if she had any words for the parole board, Rebecca simply said, "Do they sleep well?" It wasn't just Rebecca who suffered. The family of Casonya Crawford, the bright 14-year-old who dreamed of becoming a nurse, was equally devastated. Her mother, Teresa, couldn't bring herself to enter her daughter's room. The walls were still decorated with posters, photographs, and the quiet promise of a life just beginning. Her death was more than murder. It was theft, a future stolen, a voice silenced, a light snuffed out. Teresa became an advocate, not by choice, but by survival. She began attending victims' rights meetings. She spoke at parole reform events. She told anyone who would listen that her daughter was not just a name in a case file. She was a person, a soul, a heartbeat that once danced to music in their living room. And now, because a monster was allowed to roam free, that music had stopped. What chilled people the most about Anthony Kirkland's crimes wasn't just the brutality, it was the calculation. He didn't explode in sudden fits of rage. He stalked, he waited, he planned. And when he killed, he didn't panic. He covered his tracks. He burned the evidence. He watched as communities panicked. He saw his victims' faces on the news and smiled to himself, knowing no one had caught him yet. That level of cruelty, so calm, so measured, was what truly made him monstrous. Psychologists later described him as a classic predatory sociopath. He exhibited traits of narcissism, antisocial behavior, and a disturbing lack of empathy. But it went deeper than that. He didn't just lack remorse, he seemed to take pride in it. In one chilling interview with detectives, he was asked if he felt bad. His answer was, "What good would that do now?" No sorrow, no humanity, just cold logic. The courtroom testimonies were some of the most gut-wrenching ever recorded in Hamilton County. One juror later admitted to vomiting during the trial. The photos, the autopsy descriptions, the recorded confessions, everything pointed to a man who saw human life as disposable, especially the lives of women and girls. But perhaps the most haunting moment came not during the trial, but during a private interview conducted later. A retired detective, speaking anonymously, revealed something that had never been released publicly. During a break in questioning, when the cameras were off and the room was quiet, Anthony Kirkland looked across the table and said, "You know I wasn't done, right?" The detective asked what he meant. Kirkland replied, "There were more coming. I had names, faces. I just didn't get to them yet." The weight of those words is unbearable. More coming. How many more children would have died? How many more families shattered? That he was caught when he wasn't just a relief, it was a narrowly missed catastrophe, and the city would never forget that. In the aftermath of the trial, reforms began. Slowly, painfully. Laws surrounding parole for violent offenders were re-examined. Victim impact statements were given greater weight. Background checks for transitional housing were tightened. But the changes came too late for four families. For them, every legislative step forward felt like salt in a wound. Some asked why the death penalty was necessary. Others asked why it took so long. For the victims' families, neither question really mattered. What mattered was that the man who had destroyed so many lives would never walk free again. But still, even that didn't feel like enough. Because justice, when delayed or denied, doesn't feel like justice at all. It feels like a compromise, a cruel trade between the system and the survivors, where the cost is always too high. In a small room, far from the cameras, far from the lawyers and judges and reporters, a father once sat staring at a photo of his daughter. Her smile, captured in better times, seemed almost too radiant to be real. And as he looked at it, he whispered, "I hope she didn't feel too much pain." That's the kind of question families are left with. Not verdicts, not sentences, but questions. Haunting, unanswerable questions that echo in every room where a child once lived. Long after the trial ended and Anthony Kirkland was sealed behind bars awaiting execution, the ripple effect of his crimes continued to move outward, not just through the families of the victims, but through the communities that had once trusted that the system worked. Cincinnati was a city scarred. In classrooms where Esme Kenney had once raised her hand shyly to answer a question, teachers now spoke in hushed tones about safety. On the streets where Casonya had laughed with friends, silence had crept in like a fog. These weren't just neighborhoods anymore. They were crime scenes wrapped in memory. Local churches held memorials, schools increased security, and quietly parents started changing their routines. No more walking alone. No more just a quick trip without checking in. The fear wasn't loud. It was soft, consistent, a dull throb that lived inside every glance over the shoulder. And beneath it all, the question that no one could escape. How had this man been allowed back into the world? The answer was buried in paperwork, in overworked parole boards, in a judicial system more focused on rehabilitation quotas than human patterns of violence. Anthony Kirkland had been flagged early in his original incarceration. There were signs of manipulation, of superficial charm, of a man who said all the right things but meant none of them. Still, when 16 years passed, the system saw numbers, not nuance. They saw time served, not time calculated. They saw checkboxes ticked off, not the calculated patience of a predator waiting for his next chance. He didn't kill out of impulse. That much was clear. He planned, he adapted. And what chilled investigators most was that, unlike many serial offenders, he didn't follow a clear pattern based on race, age, or physical type, other than the fact that they were all women or girls. His motive wasn't lust or greed, it was power. It was the act of extinguishing a life and then watching the world suffer in its absence. In prison, Anthony Kirkland continued to show the same disturbing detachment he had exhibited during the investigation. Psychiatrists who met with him described him as present but emotionally vacant. He answered questions, he told stories, but always with a slight smile, a quiet pleasure in knowing he still held power over others, because he knew things about those nights that no one else would ever understand. He had the final moments of each of those girls locked in his memory, and the thought of that haunted their families more than any legal document ever could. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case came from the evidence found on Kirkland's phone and in his belongings. Investigators uncovered what they described as trophies, not physical items, but digital records, searches, notes, even chilling entries in a journal where he wrote about his hunger. He had been fantasizing, documenting, preparing. Every time he walked past a playground or a high school, there was a record of his observations. These weren't just accidents. These were hunts. And yet, in the public sphere, there were people who didn't want to look too closely. It was easier, safer to call him a monster and move on. But for those who worked the case, especially the female officers, the mothers on the jury, the counselors who sat with victims' families, they knew that the true horror of Anthony Kirkland was that he didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone who might pump your gas, someone who might hold the door open. He smiled, he spoke politely, he blended in, and that camouflage, his greatest weapon, was what allowed him to get so close, so often. In one quiet moment, a detective who had worked on the Esme Kenney case recounted the day they informed Esme's mother that her daughter was gone. That moment, he said, broke something in me I don't think will ever heal. Rebecca Kenney didn't scream. She didn't cry right away. She just stood there, frozen, as if the information didn't fit into her world, as if the words themselves rejected the air. And when she finally asked how, when the detective said the words strangulation and fire, she collapsed, not from weakness, but from something deeper. A mother's body rejecting the unbearable truth. That pain echoed through every family connected to Kirkland's trail of violence. Mary Jo Newton, one of the earlier victims, had battled drug addiction, but was trying to turn her life around. She had begun attending recovery meetings. Her family remembers her laugh, loud and contagious. She loved gospel music and used to sing along in the kitchen, regardless of who was listening. To them, she wasn't a statistic or a case number. She was hope. She was someone who had stumbled but was rising again. And then she met Anthony Kirkland. Kimya Rolison was just 25 when she vanished. Her family described her as sweet, trusting, and too kind for her own good. She had a young son, and when she didn't return home one night, they knew something was wrong. Her body was found burned beyond recognition, and that final detail, the fire, connected her to the others. But at the time, no one knew what kind of pattern they were staring at. It took too long to connect the dots, too many dead ends, too many maybe later case reviews. When it all came together, when Kirkland was finally caught, it felt almost too late to call it a victory. 4 women, 4 sets of dreams, 4 lives that were rich with potential, stolen by a man who should have never had the chance. Years later, when Esme Kenney spoke at a community vigil, she looked out at a sea of flickering candles and said, "I don't want you to remember her for how she died. I want you to remember the way she made people feel. I want you to remember her music, her light. Because Anthony Kirkland took her from me, but he doesn't get to take that." The crowd stood in silence. Not because they had no words, but because none would ever be enough. Anthony Kirkland remained on death row. And though appeals would follow, though the machinery of the legal system would keep grinding, as it always does, the outcome felt inevitable. He had written his own sentence long before the court ever had, in his choices, in his crimes, in the scars he left behind. And yet justice is never clean, even with a guilty verdict, even with a death sentence. Justice is messy, slow, and incomplete, because for every courtroom win, there is still an empty bedroom, a school desk never filled, a mother who wakes up every morning hoping it was just a nightmare, and a city that will never quite forget how easily a predator slipped through its cracks. Years passed, but the wounds didn't close. They thickened, they scarred. They lived in the voices of broken mothers, in the trembling hands of jurors who still saw the crime scene photos in their sleep, and in the quiet dread of girls walking home at dusk in Cincinnati. Because evil had worn a familiar face once, and that face had smiled. Anthony Kirkland's name had become a stain, not just on Ohio's criminal history, but on the conscience of a justice system that had gambled with human lives and lost. While Kirkland sat on death row, appeals started as expected. Some were automatic, others were tactical. His attorneys, as bound by duty as they were to procedure, argued mental illness, emotional abuse, and childhood trauma. They pointed to his background, a youth riddled with neglect, molestation, instability, and said he had never stood a chance. They said the system created him long before it failed to contain him. But for the families of his victims, those arguments landed like cruel echoes in a hollow room. What about the childhoods he destroyed? What about Esme's chance at growing up? What about Casonya's dreams of becoming a nurse? Or Mary Jo's path to recovery? Or Kimya's son, now growing up without a mother? No argument could erase what he did. Public interest in the case would occasionally flare back up. A new hearing date, a motion filed, a brief mention on the local evening news. But for the most part, time did what time always does. It dulled the edges. New tragedies took over headlines. But behind closed doors in quiet corners of the city, the pain still pulsed. For the Kenney family, grief became an act of remembrance. Rebecca transformed her home into a memorial, photos of Esme, awards, drawings she made in school. She lit a candle every night at 7:03 p.m., the time Esme had left for her last jog. That ritual kept her close, and when she spoke to the press, rarely cautiously, she always said the same thing. We weren't supposed to bury her. She was supposed to bury me. The heartbreak wasn't just personal, it was communal. Entire school communities mourned Esme. Her classmates held fundraisers in her name. A scholarship was established. Choirs sang her favorite songs in tribute. It was as if everyone felt the need to protect her memory, to make up for the protection she never got. In those years that followed, more light was shed on the deep flaws within the parole system that had allowed Kirkland to go free after his first killing. Investigative journalists unearthed transcripts, internal memos, and evaluations from his time in prison in the 1990s. What they found was horrifying, not because it was hidden, but because it was ignored. Psychological evaluations had repeatedly flagged Kirkland as manipulative, emotionally volatile, and dangerous. One 1994 report described him as an individual with strong antisocial tendencies and a potential for explosive behavior. Another in 1999 said he exhibits a pattern of minimizing culpability and deflecting blame. Yet when his parole hearing came, these reports were downplayed. The focus shifted instead to his clean behavior behind bars and his participation in therapy sessions he attended but never truly engaged in. His release wasn't an oversight, it was a calculated risk, one that cost 4 women their lives. As public outrage grew, state legislators were forced to act. New parole laws were introduced, particularly for violent offenders with a history of predatory behavior. The Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction faced intense scrutiny. Victims' advocacy groups gained momentum, and public officials were forced to reckon with a grim reality. Anthony Kirkland should have never walked free, but reforms didn't bring peace. For the families, peace was impossible. What they sought wasn't justice, it was accountability, and even that felt too little, too late. Kirkland, meanwhile, began to lean into his notoriety. In prison, he was known. Other inmates feared him or idolized him, depending on their own darkness. He never showed remorse. In interviews, when he did speak, he was clinical, almost proud. One prison guard recalled overhearing Kirkland describe the sensation of taking a life as feeling like electricity in your blood. Another described him as the kind of man who made silence feel dangerous. In his cell, Kirkland wrote, he filled notebooks with letters, poems, thoughts. Some made no sense. Others were hauntingly articulate. He wrote once, "I am the sum of all your neglect," a sentence that read more like blame than reflection. He never apologized. He never reached out to the families. His view of the world remained warped and self-centered. He was not a man haunted by what he had done. He was a man haunted only by the fact that he was caught. It was in this state, silent, remorseless, and defiant, that he continued to sit on death row. Year after year, waiting, knowing that the wheels of justice turned slowly. And yet even that didn't satisfy the victims' families. Because while he breathed, while he ate, while he slept, their daughters did not. But this story, as much as it is about the horror Kirkland inflicted, is also about the strength that rose in the ashes of his destruction. In every home he shattered, someone stood back up. Casonya Crawford, mother of Casonya, became a vocal advocate for victim support programs in Cincinnati. She spoke at city council meetings, attended parole board oversight hearings, and helped establish a hotline for families who felt ignored by the justice system. "My daughter's voice was stolen," she said, "but mine wasn't." And for Esme Kenney, survival became a form of defiance. She didn't speak often, but when she did, people listened. "I wake up every day with the weight of her absence," she once told a reporter. "But I also wake up knowing that I will not let him define the end of her story. She was more than what he did to her." The Kenneys also supported other families dealing with violence, quietly, without attention. Rebecca would write letters to mothers who lost their children, sometimes just one line, "I know, and I'm still here." That quiet solidarity, born of unbearable loss, became a kind of resistance against the darkness Kirkland tried to spread. For all the pain he caused, he could not destroy that. In 2020, over a decade after the trial, Anthony Kirkland's final appeal was denied. The Supreme Court of Ohio upheld the original sentence. And for the families, though it did not bring back their daughters, it brought something close to resolution. Not closure, because there is no closure in this kind of loss, but a door slowly closing on a long corridor of suffering. Still, the question remains, how many more are there? Not just like Kirkland, but how many men walk the streets with darkness behind their eyes, masked by smiles, undetected by systems too tired or too blind to look closely? That question keeps mothers up at night. It sends shivers down spines in quiet towns and crowded cities alike. Because Anthony Kirkland was not a ghost. He was not a myth. He was real. He lived next door. He rode the bus. He smiled at store clerks. And no one knew. That is the horror. Not just what he did, but how ordinary he seemed until he wasn't. It's difficult to trace the path of evil when it hides behind routine. Anthony Kirkland knew that. He didn't move through the world as a man with a knife in his hand or blood on his shoes. He moved quietly, methodically, as someone who had studied how to seem invisible. He knew how to walk without suspicion, how to speak just the right amount, how to behave when someone was watching. And that was what made him so dangerous. He wasn't the stranger in the alley or the monster in the dark. He was the man who held open doors, who nodded politely, who passed by unnoticed until it was too late. After the 2009 conviction and his death sentence, the process of reckoning truly began, not just for the families, but for the state of Ohio itself. The governor's office initiated a private audit into parole board procedures, and the findings weren't just alarming, they were infuriating. Dozens of violent offenders had been released based on incomplete evaluations, crowded dockets, and outdated psychological standards. Anthony Kirkland's name sat at the center of those findings like a rotting core. He was the example used in every reform bill. He was the reminder on every parole board training module. He became the face of failure. But behind those headlines were real people still shattered, still aching, still trying to find ways to make their daughters feel real again in a world that had moved on. Every holiday was a wound, every birthday a reminder of absence, and every news article that used the word closure felt like an insult to those who would never hear their child's voice again. One of the most heartbreaking rituals came from the Rolison family. Every year on the anniversary of Kimya's murder, her sister would visit the place where Kimya's body had been discovered. Not because she wanted to see it, but because she wanted the world to remember that Kimya had been there, that a living, breathing woman had once stood in that exact spot before evil found her. She would stand in silence for a few minutes, then say a single sentence out loud, "You were here, and I still am." That was her act of defiance. That was her way of keeping the story from fading into statistics. Mary Jo Newton's son, just 10 when she was killed, grew up in a home that tried to shield him from the worst of the details. But children are intuitive, and no amount of silence can fully hide trauma. As he got older, he started asking questions. And when he was finally told the truth, he sat quietly for a long time before whispering, "She didn't get to see me grow up." The weight of that sentence never left the room. He didn't cry, he didn't yell, he just understood, in the way that only someone who has been robbed of love can understand. The city continued trying to heal. Neighborhoods held community safety events. Schools brought in counselors and survivor speakers. A park bench was dedicated to Esme Kenney near her school, engraved with words from her favorite book. Her mother often visited it in the early morning hours, before anyone else was around. Sometimes she brought a book and read aloud to the empty bench. Sometimes she just sat, eyes closed, trying to remember the exact sound of her daughter's laugh. Anthony Kirkland never said the names of his victims. Not in court, not in interviews. He never acknowledged them as people. They were the girl, the woman, the one from the woods. That refusal to give them dignity, even in death, was one of the cruelest elements of his behavior. Psychologists said it was a control tactic, a way to dehumanize what he had done and preserve his power. But for the families, it was another cut, another wound, another sign that there was no soul inside the man who had destroyed their world. Prison guards noted that he rarely spoke. He didn't participate in group events. He didn't socialize. He had no visitors, no letters, no outside connections. He was, in every sense, a man locked away not just by bars, but by the irreversible consequences of his choices. One guard during a confidential interview said, "He walks like a man who knows the world doesn't want him anymore. And for once, I think he finally understands what that means." Still, understanding came too late. The damage was already done. The young girls whose lives he had extinguished, who had trusted the world to be good to them, never got the chance to understand anything beyond their final moments. And that, more than any legal motion, was the true tragedy of this case. They never got to grow old, never got to chase dreams, never got to reclaim their voices. Some of the community efforts in the years since the case have tried to make up for that in small but powerful ways. A scholarship in Esme Kenney's name has helped several students pursue music education. A mural of Casonya Crawford, full of vibrant color and movement, was painted near the street where she used to walk to school. Her mother, Teresa, wept when she saw it for the first time. Not because of the beauty, but because the mural finally made people look at her daughter, not as a victim, but as a person who mattered. One afternoon, during a school assembly on safety and self-defense, a young girl raised her hand and asked, "Who was Esme Kenney?" And in that moment, her name wasn't just a tragedy, it was a legacy. Teachers spoke of her kindness, her voice, her curiosity. They spoke of her as someone real, not just a cautionary tale, but a girl who should have been sitting in that very room, asking her own questions. The pain, however, never truly left the families. Grief is not linear. It's not something you move past. It's something you learn to carry. Rebecca Kenney often described it as walking with stones in her pockets. You still walk, she'd say, but you never forget the weight. On the anniversary of Esme's death each year, she'd sit by the park bench memorial and read aloud from Esme's favorite books. She didn't do it for closure. She did it so the world would hear her daughter's voice again, even if only through hers. Anthony Kirkland remained in solitary confinement for long stretches of time, monitored more for his own protection than anyone else's. Inmates who had learned of his crimes, especially those involving young girls, were known to lash out at him, spit at him, scream threats. And yet he rarely reacted. He stayed still, not in remorse, but in retreat. He had built a prison within the prison, where the walls weren't made of stone, but denial and silence. There was a growing belief that if he ever did die, whether by natural causes or execution, he would do so without ever offering the families what they wanted most, the truth. Not just about what he had done, but why. What did he feel? Did he remember their faces? Did he ever dream of them? Did their screams echo in his mind the way they echoed in theirs? Those questions sat unanswered in the hearts of mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends. And perhaps they always would. In 2023, the state quietly announced that Kirkland's latest execution date would be postponed. Again. The reason? A shortage of the drugs used for lethal injection. The announcement came with no ceremony, no press conference, just a small, formal notice mailed to the families and posted to the court docket. For many, it was the final insult. The man who had taken so much now remained alive not because of justice, but because of logistics, bureaucracy, supply chains. Still, through it all, the voices of the families never fell silent. They refused to let the system bury their pain with time. They spoke out. They testified. They told their stories, not for sympathy, but for survival, because silence, they believed, would have meant Kirkland had taken even more than he already had. In one final interview with a local journalist, Rebecca Kenney was asked what justice felt like. She paused, then said, "Justice would be waking up tomorrow and hearing my daughter's footsteps on the stairs again. But since that's not possible, justice is reminding the world she was here, that she mattered, that he didn't win." And in that moment, more than in any verdict, any sentence, or any prison cell, justice had its voice. The clock kept turning, but for the families left in Anthony Kirkland's wake, the passage of time never meant healing. It simply meant more days lived without the people they loved. They were forced to navigate birthdays that never came, high school graduations that never happened, anniversaries that felt more like commemorations of violence than milestones of joy. Every year, they gathered the courage to remember, to speak, to write, to keep their daughters' names from vanishing into the noise of the world. But behind those acts of remembrance was always the same silent question: why? Kirkland never answered it. Not in court, not in prison, not even to his legal team. Despite opportunities and encouragement from multiple sides, he never gave a full confession. His explanations were shallow, clinical, and devoid of real remorse. When pressed for motive, he once replied, "Because I was angry." When asked about the fear his victims must have felt, he said, "They probably knew." That emptiness, that complete detachment, was what terrified people most. It wasn't just the murders, it was the fact that he had done them without feeling, without pause, without any flicker of regret. Yet even from a cell, Anthony Kirkland's shadow lingered far beyond the walls of Chillicothe. Police in neighboring counties reopened unsolved cases. The FBI briefly reviewed other missing persons reports tied to areas where Kirkland had lived, traveled, or worked. In a handful of files, patterns emerged. Young women, mostly marginalized, some with histories of homelessness or abuse, who had vanished without a trace. Their cases had grown cold years ago, forgotten in filing cabinets and budget constraints. But now, with Kirkland back in the headlines, investigators were forced to ask, had he killed before 2005? Was there more? No definitive proof ever surfaced, but some officers believed, quietly off the record, that the answer was yes. They believed Anthony Kirkland was already a predator long before the world learned his name. For the Rolison family, those lingering questions only deepened the hurt. Kimya's mother, a quiet woman who rarely spoke to the press, once broke her silence at a candlelight vigil and said, "If he's done more, then there are more mothers like me, and I pray they get answers. Because this kind of pain, it doesn't just end one day, it becomes you." The community efforts that had risen in the aftermath of the murders continued. In schools, students learned the names of the girls not as victims, but as individuals who once sat where they sat, walked the same halls, played the same games. Esme Kenney became a symbol not just of loss, but of light. Her love of music lived on in student recitals and local concerts held in her memory. At one such event, a teenage girl performed Esme's favorite piece, Clair de Lune by Debussy. When the final note faded, the room stayed silent for several seconds, heavy with emotion, before the applause began. It wasn't a performance, it was a tribute, a whisper to the past. Even the officers who had worked the case struggled with its legacy. Some retired early, others sought therapy. One detective admitted in a podcast interview that Esme's case was the one that broke him. He had seen violence before, but never like that. Never so cruel, so deliberate, so unnecessary. He still remembered the wooded area where Esme's body was found, the charred branches, the smell of gasoline in the air, the silence of the birds above. It was like the forest itself had recoiled, he said. Kirkland remained silent. On the rare occasions he did speak to journalists, he never answered the hard questions. He dismissed inquiries about remorse. He mocked the press. In one particularly disturbing letter sent to a reporter, he wrote, "People love monsters. That's why they keep asking me to talk." It was chilling. It was calculated. It was the essence of who he was. A man who knew the power of fear and wielded it even behind bars. And yet the families refused to let his words be louder than their daughters' memories. They made documentaries. They collaborated with advocacy groups. They told their stories in schools, in churches, on podcasts, and at trauma recovery events. Every word spoken was an act of resistance, a refusal to let Kirkland have the final say. In 2024, news broke that Ohio had not executed a prisoner in several years due to legal complications and drug shortages. Anthony Kirkland's execution date was once again pushed. The announcement was made in a 3-sentence press release. No apology, no acknowledgement of what it meant for the families. Just another delay in a justice system that already felt paralyzed. The Kenneys received the news on a Thursday morning. Rebecca didn't cry. She didn't even speak. She simply folded the letter, set it on the table, and stared out the window. She'd seen this happen before. Hope raised, hope crushed. A cycle she was too familiar with. The world moved on, but the families didn't. They couldn't. Healing wasn't just difficult, it was impossible when the person who caused the pain remained alive. His death postponed by bureaucracy, his silence uninterrupted. What comfort could there be in knowing your child's killer slept safely every night under state protection? Still, the families found their own paths forward, not toward healing, but toward something close to peace. Mary Jo Newton's son, now a young adult, became a social worker. He said his mother's life and her death taught him that broken systems needed voices from within. He wanted to be one of those voices, and through him, Mary Jo lived on. Kimya Rolison's sister went back to college. She wrote her thesis on systemic failures in post-incarceration monitoring. In the dedication, she wrote, "For Kimya, I remember your laugh. I remember your light. I fight because you can't." And Esme, her story traveled far beyond Cincinnati. Her name appeared in criminal justice journals, in victim advocacy reports, in music programs across the country. A documentary filmmaker created a short film about her life, not her death, and it won an award for narrative compassion. Audiences cried not because of how Esme died, but because of how beautifully she had lived. That was the ultimate triumph. Because Anthony Kirkland wanted to erase, to destroy, to silence. But the world, wounded, grieving, but not broken, refused to let him. In the shadows of the justice system, there is a quiet fatigue, an exhaustion felt by families who wait for a resolution that never quite arrives. The death sentence that once brought a sense of justice to the loved ones of Esme Kenney, Casonya Crawford, Mary Jo Newton, and Kimya Rolison had long since turned into a lingering ache. Not because the sentence wasn't deserved, but because it had become a symbol of a system that couldn't seem to carry it through. Anthony Kirkland was still alive, still waking up each morning behind thick gray walls, still breathing in a world where his victims had long been buried. The promise of finality, of an end, remained a thread dangled just out of reach. For many, that delay was worse than the crime itself, because the pain hadn't dulled, it had been put on a loop. Rewind, repeat. Each appeal, each news story, each delay was a reopening, and every reopening meant they had to relive the horror. Esme's mother, Rebecca, once said, "Grief would be manageable if it stayed in the past. But this never stays in the past. It walks through the door every time his name is spoken again." By 2025, nearly 2 decades had passed since Anthony Kirkland had been released on parole and restarted his reign of terror. And in those years, Cincinnati had changed. New families had moved into the neighborhoods where the murders occurred. New children played in the parks that once echoed with silence. But for those who remembered, the scars were still visible. The murder sites had become informal landmarks, spoken of in low voices, in passing, as warnings. This was where Esme was found. That alley is where Kimya was last seen. A tree in the woods still bore the faint mark of where police had once posted a notice. The land remembered even if the city tried to move on. The trauma of Kirkland's crimes had become generational. The younger siblings of his victims were now adults. Some had children of their own, and they told the stories softly, carefully, about the aunts they never got to meet, the sisters who should have been there at birthdays, holidays, weddings. One little girl asked her mother, "Why is Aunt Casonya only in pictures?" And the answer came with a long pause. Because someone very bad made her go away. In the face of that darkness, the families turned pain into purpose. Together, they helped pass what became known as the Kimya Rolison Act, state legislation that reformed parole board procedures for violent offenders and mandated trauma-informed review panels. It wasn't a sweeping change. It didn't undo the past, but it was something. A line drawn in law that said, "Never again." The bill passed unanimously. Lawmakers who once ignored the issue now stood on the courthouse steps, praising the courage of the families who fought for change. But behind the cameras, those families knew what was really true. That the bill wasn't just about legislation, it was about names, about faces, about girls who smiled in old yearbook photos. Girls who should have been living full lives. Meanwhile, Anthony Kirkland remained locked away, older now, slower. A man whose notoriety had faded, but whose crimes still lived in the marrow of the city. Reports from inside the prison indicated that he had become increasingly reclusive. He no longer answered letters from journalists. He declined interviews. He no longer responded to even his attorneys unless required. It was as though he had folded into himself, unrepentant, unbroken, but no longer loud. Still, there was no apology, no confession, no humanity. And so the victims' families stopped asking for those things. They no longer waited for Kirkland to give them peace. They began building their own. Each anniversary, Esme's friends organized a walk-in-light event, an evening where people lit lanterns and walked through the city park where she had once jogged. They didn't speak. They didn't chant. They just walked, holding lanterns, holding memories, holding each other. Rebecca attended each one. Every year, she carried Esme's old choir sheet, folded, faded, protected in plastic, a small symbol of the voice that had once moved everyone to tears. Casonya's mother created a mentorship program for at-risk girls in her neighborhood. She called it Sonia's house, and it operated out of a small converted home not far from where her daughter was last seen. Inside were books, food, music, and a wall where every girl could paint a mural. She said, "If I couldn't protect my own, maybe I can protect someone else's." Kimya's sister began speaking at criminal justice panels, drawing attention to how crimes against Black women are often under-investigated and underreported. She was not just a victim, she said. She was a woman, a mother, a soul, and she deserved better. Mary Jo Newton's son, now a counselor, wrote a book about grief. It wasn't about his mother directly, but she lived on in every page, in the way he described love, loss, and learning to live again without hating the world. And through all these lives, through all this healing and resistance and love, the one thing Anthony Kirkland could never destroy continued to rise: memory. Because while he wanted his victims to vanish, they had become immortal. Not through him, but through those who refused to forget. In 2025, whispers began about a possible date for Kirkland's execution finally being set again. This time officials said it might happen. The drugs were available. The court challenges were exhausted. But by then, the families no longer waited on it with the urgency they once had. They had made their peace with a different kind of justice. The justice of legacy, of remembrance, of reclaiming power from someone who tried to take it all. One day, Anthony Kirkland will die, and the world may not notice.